She didn't scream when her own father grabbed her arm and dragged her into the street like something he was done with. She didn't fight. She didn't beg. Clara Weston had learned young and painfully that a woman with nothing has only one weapon left, and that weapon is letting them believe she has even less than that. But when a tall stranger stepped out of the crowd, looked past every broken thing about her, and said, "Nobody's selling anybody today," something cracked open inside her chest that she thought had been buried with her mother. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to this channel and don't leave until the very last word. And drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. She didn't make a sound when her father grabbed her arm and dragged her into the street. Not a word. Not a cry. Clara Weston had learned the hard way, and early, that making sounds only gave people something to aim at. Roy Weston released her arm in front of the general store, stepped back, and addressed the town of Delwood, Colorado, like a man who believed he was doing everyone a favor. "Deaf girl," he announced. "Works hard. Costs nothing to feed. $12 takes her off my hands today." The summer of 1878 had baked Delwood into something dry and mean, and the people standing on the boardwalks had that look that people get when the heat has been going on too long, irritable, bored, ready to watch something happen that wasn't happening to them. About 20 of them gathered within the first 2 minutes. Not one of them moved toward Clara. She stood with her canvas bag at her feet, and her hands loose at her sides, and her face showing nothing. She had been practicing that face for 3 years. She was very good at it. Roy kept talking. She didn't listen to him. She already knew everything he was going to say. Garfield Pruitt came down off the boardwalk and walked a slow circle around her. He was the largest cattle operator in the county, and he walked like he knew it. He stopped in front of her and snapped his fingers twice an inch from her face. Clara did not blink. Pruitt grunted. "She really can't hear?" "Born that way," Roy said. "Don't let it bother you. She follows instructions fine if you show her what you want." "What if something goes wrong out at the property? She can't call for help." "Then nothing goes wrong," Roy said. 8 years without an accident. 12, Clara thought. 12 years. He can't even keep the number straight. Pruitt walked around her again. She stared at the far end of the street and breathed in, breathed out, and thought about the oilcloth packet sewn into the lining of her canvas bag, and thought about the names written on those papers, and thought, hold on. Just hold on a little longer. $8, Pruitt said. 12, Roy said. 9, final offer. 10.50. She had known this was coming. She had not known exactly how she would survive it. She still didn't know. But she was still standing, which was more than Roy had bargained for when he'd started this morning. Then the crowd shifted, not dramatically, just a ripple. The way a group of people moves when something has entered their awareness that wasn't there before. Clara felt it before she saw it, because she had spent 3 years learning to read the things she wasn't supposed to be able to hear. She turned her head slightly. A big gray horse came around the north corner of Caldwell Street at a walk. The man on it was large and unhurried, wearing a hat pulled low with the look of someone who had ridden a long way and was not particularly impressed by what he'd found at the end of the road. He took in the scene on the street in one long level sweep. He stepped down from the horse, tied it to the post outside the feed store, and walked into the middle of the street. He stopped about 8 feet from Roy Weston and looked at him with an expression that contained nothing aggressive and nothing warm, and was somehow considerably more threatening than either. "What's happening here?" he said. Not a question. Roy blinked. He had not expected to be asked. "Private business. Move along." "Middle of the street," the man said. "Ain't much private about it." Pruitt took a half step back. He had the instinct which some men have, and Roy Weston had never developed to recognize when the temperature of a situation had changed. Roy did not have that instinct. "I'm selling," he said. "Willing seller, willing buyer. No law against it." "You're selling your daughter," the man said. He said it in a voice so flat and clear that the words hung over the street like something physical. Several people on the boardwalk suddenly found reasons to look elsewhere. Harriet Bloom, who ran the dress shop and had been watching with an expression of pained sympathy, took one step forward and then stopped. Roy's face went red. She can't hear what I'm saying. She's no use to me. You don't know that, the man said. He looked at Clara then, not at her worn dress, not at the canvas bag, at her face, directly, steadily, with the particular attention of a man who was actually trying to see something, rather than just looking at it. Clara held his gaze and showed him nothing, and felt somewhere behind her ribs something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Crack open just slightly, like a door in a cold house that someone had finally pushed. He looked back at Roy. How much? Roy's eyes narrowed. $12. 20, the man said. He already had the bills out. And you don't come near her again. The street went silent. Roy looked at the money. He looked at the man. He looked at Clara with an expression that was almost guilt almost, and then he took the money and walked toward the saloon without looking back. Clara watched him go. 20 years of breath left her body in one long, slow exhale. She looked at the man who had just paid $20 for her dignity, who was already turning toward his horse. I've got a place up in the foothills, he said, not looking at her. 22 miles. You'd work for real wages. He untied the horse and gathered the reins, and then looked at her over his shoulder. You coming? Clara looked down the street where her father had gone. She looked at the crowd, which was already dissolving back into its ordinary business, the entertainment concluded. She looked at Tom Garrett, her mother's cousin, a man who had known her since she was 4 years old, and Tom Garrett looked at the ground. She picked up her bag and walked toward the horse. He didn't help her mount. He held the animal steady and let her manage it herself, and she was more grateful for that than she could have put into words. She'd been lifted and placed and managed her entire life. Climbing onto a horse under her own power felt like something she didn't have a name for yet. They rode north out of Delwood without speaking. The road climbed into the foothills, the air changing quality as they gained elevation, cooler, cleaner, smelling of pine and dry grass. After 40 minutes, he spoke without turning. You can hear. Clara said nothing. He didn't repeat it. The horses moved through a switchback. When they came out the other side, Delwood had shrunk to a handful of small shapes far below. How did you know? She said. Her voice came out rougher than intended. She used it so rarely it had developed a kind of rust. But there it was. Her actual voice. The first true thing she'd said to anyone in 3 years. Pruitt came up behind you, Holt said. You moved before he was close enough to see, and when I said your father didn't know what you could hear, you almost showed me something. He paused. It wasn't much. Most people aren't looking, she said. No, he agreed. They're not. Why were you? I was quiet for a moment. The trail curved through a stand of pine. I've known people who learned to disappear while they were still standing in the room, he said. It has a certain look. I'm not going to ask you why you learned it. Clara absorbed that. You bought me, she said. Most men think that earns them answers. I bought you out of a situation, he said. Not into one. You want to leave when we get there, the road goes south as easy as north. She didn't answer. I didn't seem to need her to. His name was Holt Calloway. She pieced this together over the next hour, from the few things he offered without being asked. He ran cattle in the foothills. He came into Delwood 4 or 5 times a year for supplies. He had worked the property alone for 11 years. He said all of this, the way a man states facts he considers relevant rather than interesting. She offered nothing in return, and he didn't ask. When they reached the ranch, as the sun dropped toward the western peaks, she understood immediately that the man who lived here had been alone a long time. Not from neglect. The place was solid, well kept. The barn in good repair, the fence lines straight. But from the particular quality of order that only develops when one person has been doing everything and has arranged it exactly the way they need it and has stopped expecting anyone else to be involved. She stepped down from the horse and stood in the yard and listened. Wind in the pines. A creek running somewhere. The silence of a place where no one had been arguing recently, which was a kind of silence she had forgotten existed. 2 rooms, Holt said, coming out of the barn. I sleep in the back. Front room's yours. There's a cot and clean blankets. He said it without any awkwardness, plain information plainly offered. Supper in an hour. I'll help, she said. He looked at her briefly. Then come inside. The kitchen told her things about him that he hadn't said. The pans hung in order of size. The dry goods labeled in a plain functional hand. The firewood stacked inside the door with the driest pieces on top. Systems developed by a man who had been answering to no one but the work for a long time. She moved through the space, quietly getting the measure of it, and when she understood where things were, she helped without waiting to be directed. He noticed this, but said nothing. They ate beans and salt pork with cornbread. Plain food, sufficient food, unapologetic about both qualities. She ate everything on her plate. What are you behind on? She said. He looked up from his plate. The order in this kitchen, she said. The barn, the pasture, those are maintained. But there's a crate of records in the corner that hasn't been touched in months. So what's the problem you haven't solved yet? A beat of silence. Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, but close to it. Boundary dispute, he said. Neighbor to the south filed a competing claim on 60 acres of my east pasture. Says the original survey markers were off. The Territorial Land Office wants documentation, and He stopped. I'm not comfortable with that kind of paperwork. Clara set down her coffee. Who's the neighbor? Ellis Stafford. Runs a big operation out of Roanoke Flats. Her hand didn't move. Her face didn't change. She had been practicing stillness for 3 years, and she used every bit of it now, because the name Ellis Stafford was not a name she had expected to hear at a dinner table 22 miles from Delwood, and the fact that she was hearing it here now meant that what she'd thought was escape was something else entirely. You know him, Holt said. Not personally. But she looked at him across the table. She was doing the arithmetic of trust, which was arithmetic she'd learned to do very slowly and very carefully, and the numbers were not adding up the way she wanted them to. Because trusting this man meant telling him something that put him in danger. And not trusting him meant sitting on information that could save his ranch and saying nothing. He's been doing this for 4 years, she said. Filing competing claims across the territory. The survey dispute is standard. It's how he gets a foothold. Then he offers to settle. The settlement always goes his way, and he always has more lawyers than the other person can afford. She looked at the table. I know of at least 3 cases. None of them ended well for the original owner. How do you know this? Holt said. She reached into her canvas bag and removed a folded packet of papers wrapped in oilcloth. She set it on the table between them. He looked at it. He did not reach for it. What is that? Copies, she said. Documents from Stafford's operation, payments to county clerks, false survey filings, chain of transactions going back to 1874. She kept her voice level. I spent 14 months collecting this. I couldn't get everything, but what's there is enough to take to a federal court. The kitchen was very quiet. That's why they ran you out of Delwood, he said. Roy thought they were doing him a favor when they brought the whiskey. She looked at her hands. They told him his deaf daughter was a liability. He was happy to believe it. Saved him the trouble of deciding himself. Holt looked at the packet on the table, then at her, then back at the packet. Who else knows you have this? No one. Did anyone follow you out of Delwood? Not yet. She met his eyes. But they will. When Stafford's people realize I'm gone, and the documents went with me, they'll ask questions. Someone will tell them you were in town this morning. Someone always tells. The silence between them now had weight and shape. This was no longer a conversation about a woman with no prospects and a man with extra room in his house. They both knew it. There's a federal marshal out of Denver, Holt said. Name of Breck, works land fraud cases across the territory. I've heard his name from a man I sell cattle to. Can you reach him? Telegraph in Harker Crossing, 2 hours south. I know a man there who won't talk about it. He paused. But that means leaving the property. And if Stafford's men are already moving, go, she said. Clara, I said go. She said it quietly, and she said it once, and she looked at him with eyes that were not asking for his assessment of her capabilities. How many rifles? Something moved through his expression. 2. And a pistol. Leave me one of the rifles. I can shoot. Where'd you learn? By myself, she said. Same place I learned everything else. She picked up her fork. Go to Harker Crossing in the morning. Send the wire. Be back before dark. She looked at him steadily. I'll know if someone's coming before they get to the house. That's not nothing. He looked at her for a long time. Long enough that another person might have filled the silence. Clara Weston was not another person. All right, he said finally. All right, she said. She lay on the cot that night and listened to the wind in the pines and the creek in the dark. The mountains pressed close here in a way that felt different from the way Delwood's buildings had pressed close. Not confining, just present. Something very old, sitting quietly nearby. In the other room, she heard the soft, careful sound of papers being unfolded. He was already reading. She stared at the ceiling and ran the names through her mind. Ellis Stafford. The 3 county clerks she could prove. The 2 she was certain of, but couldn't document. The 63 parcels across 4 counties. 68 if the referenced ones held. 14 months of work sewn into the lining of a canvas bag carried out of Delwood by a woman everyone believed couldn't hear a word being said about her. Let them keep believing it. She closed her eyes. She was up before him. Fire-going coffee pot on cornbread warming in the pan. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her with that particular stillness. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know, she said. Eggs. 3 hens. They're unreliable. I'll manage, she said. She came back with 4 eggs. He was at the table with his coffee, the oilcloth packet in front of him refolded. Read thoroughly. More than once by the look of it. She cracked the eggs into the pan and waited. 63 parcels, he said. 4 counties. Payments to 3 clerks documented. He's been running this since 1874. 68, she said. 5 more referenced, but I couldn't get the originals. The chain of payments goes to a holding company, he said, not Stafford directly. Which is why the county clerks didn't panic, she said. They could tell themselves they didn't know where the money came from. He was quiet. She brought the eggs to the table and sat down. This is enough for a federal case, he said. It's enough to start one, she said. Enough to force an investigation. Whether it's enough to finish one depends on what Marshal Breck finds when he starts pulling the thread. She looked at him across the table. Your East Pasture case is in there. Filing dates the clerk who processed it the payment that moved 3 days before the claim was submitted. Holt set down his fork. Your property was targeted specifically, she said. This wasn't a random boundary dispute. Stafford's operation identified your acreage as part of a larger consolidation. If he takes your East Pasture, he controls the water access for this entire section of the foothills. The silence that followed was the kind that comes after a man realizes the problem. He thought he understood is considerably larger than he thought. How long have you known this? He said. I knew Stafford was working this area, she said. I didn't know it was your ranch specifically until you said his name last night. But you suspected. She looked at him. I suspected that wherever I ended up, Stafford would already be there. He's been ahead of everyone for 4 years. The difference between him and me is that I now know something he doesn't know I know. That you have the documents. That I'm not deaf, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then something happened at the corner of his mouth, a movement that didn't quite become anything, but almost did. Harker Crossing, he said. I'll leave in an hour. I'll have your horse ready, she said. He left with the gray horse and his word he'd be back before dark. She stood in the yard and watched him go until the trail curved and the pines closed behind him. Then she turned and faced the ranch. She went inside and found the second rifle and checked it the way her grandfather had shown her before he died, and the world got smaller. She placed it where she could reach it in under 4 seconds, she counted. She took the oilcloth packet out of the canvas bag and pressed it behind a loose stone in the fireplace, a gap she'd spotted the night before. Then she pulled the crate of records from the corner of the front room and began to work. Holt Calloway had 11 years of accounts in that crate. She went through them methodically, receipts, tallies, land assessments, cattle records, and as she worked, she began to see not just his numbers, but the shape of his life. A man who had been reducing himself year by year to the minimum required. Less cattle than he'd once run. Fewer transactions. A smaller operation than the land could support. Not from failure. From something else. From someone who had decided that smaller was safer. That less meant less to lose. She understood that arithmetic. She had been living it herself. She kept working. The summer morning turned toward noon. Outside, the horses moved along the fence line in the heat. The creek ran. The mountains stood exactly where they had always stood. And somewhere on the southern road, she knew the questions had already begun. Stafford's men would have noticed she was gone from Delwood by now. They would ask Roy, and Roy would say a mountain cowboy named Calloway had taken her north. They would know the road. They would know the foothills. They would come up here eventually with their polite voices and their dangerous intentions, and they would expect to find a deaf woman who didn't know anything and couldn't tell anyone what she'd seen. Clara set down a receipt from 1873, picked up one from 1874, and kept working. Let them come. She would be ready long before they arrived. Holt made it back before dark. She heard the horse on the trail a full 3 minutes before he came into view, which was exactly what she'd told him would happen, and she had the rifle back on its hook and the coffee hot by the time he walked through the door. He looked at her standing at the stove, and looked at the crate of records on the table, organized, now sorted, labeled in her clean hand, and he stood there for a moment with his hat in his hand and something moving behind his eyes that he didn't say out loud. "Marshal Breck is in Pueblo," he said. "My contact sent the wire." Breck wired back inside the hour. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and set it on the table. He wants the documents. He wants a signed statement. And he wants them within 10 days before Stafford's next filing deadline at the territorial office. Clara read the wire. Read it again. 10 days. He said if the evidence is what we say it is, he can freeze Stafford's filings across all 4 counties pending investigation. Holt poured his own coffee and sat down. But he needs everything in hand before the deadline. After that, Stafford's east pasture claim on my property becomes legally recorded, and reversing it takes 2 years in court. How do we get the documents to Pueblo? Courier's too risky. Anyone Stafford has watching the roads sees a rider going south with a package, they'll intercept it. He looked at the table. Breck said he'll come to us. 4 days, maybe 5. He's got 2 deputies. Clara set the wire down. 4 days. She calculated what that meant. 4 days for Stafford's people to figure out where she'd gone. 4 days for Roy to drink enough to talk to the wrong person. 4 days for the wrong person to send word south to Roanoke Flats. She looked at Holt. "Did anyone see you in Harker Crossing?" 3 people, he said. "All of them known to me." "Known to you isn't the same as safe." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "It isn't." They sat with that for a moment. "Someone's going to come up here before Breck does," she said. "You know that." "I've been thinking about it since Harker Crossing. And I think we've got maybe 2 days before someone knocks on that door," he said. "Question is what we do when they do." Clara looked at the rifle on its hook. She looked at the crate of organized records. She looked at the oilcloth packet still behind the stone in the fireplace. Then she looked at Holt Calloway, who was watching her with the particular patience of a man who had learned that some decisions needed to arrive on their own and couldn't be rushed. "We don't run," she said. "No," he said. "We don't run." The first day passed in work. Clara finished the records and started on something more useful, a written summary of every document in the oilcloth packet, organized by date and county, with the chain of evidence laid out in plain language that a federal marshal could follow without needing to read 60 pages of financial transactions to understand what he was looking at. She worked at the kitchen table from first light until the afternoon, turned the room warm, and she wrote in the careful, precise hand she'd taught herself with her mother's books during the years Roy had decided education was a waste on a deaf girl. Holt worked the ranch. She heard him through the walls, the barn, the pasture, the fence line. He was reinforcing on the east side, nearest the road. She understood what he was doing. He was making the property look normal. A man going about his ordinary business. Nothing to investigate here. Nothing to find. Around midday, he came inside for water and looked over her shoulder at what she was writing. "You write like a lawyer," he said. "I write like someone who knew the lawyers wouldn't listen to her," she said. So she learned to make the writing do the arguing. He was quiet for a moment, reading. "This is good, Clara." She didn't answer, but she felt it land somewhere. In the afternoon, she found him replacing a hinge on the barn door, and she held the wood steady while he worked, and they moved through the task without talking. The way people do when they've developed a rhythm faster than they expected to. When he finished, he tested the door twice, and then looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. "You were in Delwood 3 years, he said. "Yes." "Collecting this whole time?" "Not at first." She leaned against the barn wall. "At first I was just trying to survive, Roy. Then one day, I found papers in his coat pocket. He'd done some hauling work for a man who worked for Stafford, and the man had left documents in the wagon. I read them." She paused. "And I understood what I was reading. That was the problem. Most people wouldn't have. Most people weren't taught land records by a mother who spent 10 years fighting to keep 40 acres in Kansas," she said. Her voice didn't change when she said it, but something in her jaw tightened briefly. "She lost in the end. But she taught me everything she knew before she did." Holt set down the hammer. He didn't say he was sorry about her mother. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "What happened to the 40 acres? Man named Creighton bought the debt and called it in the year after she died," Clara said. "Roy didn't fight it, said there was no point." She looked at the fence line. "I was 16. I thought he was right. I know better now." The silence between them was different after that, heavier. In the good way, the way silence gets when two people have exchanged something real instead of something polite. "Stafford's the same kind of man as Creighton," Holt said. "Stafford is what Creighton would have been with more money and a lawyer on retainer," Clara said. "Same method. Buy the debt, file the dispute, wait for the other person to run out of resources. The only difference is scale." She looked at him. "How much do you owe on this property?" His jaw tightened slightly. "Nothing. My father paid it clear before he died." "Then Stafford can't come at you through debt," she said. "The survey dispute is his only angle, which means the documents I have are the entire case." She met his eyes. "If he knows what I'm carrying, this ranch is where he comes first." "I know," Holt said. "I need you to know it clearly," she said. "Not as an abstract possibility, as a fact." "I know it clearly," he said. She nodded once and went back inside. The second morning arrived with the particular clarity that high-altitude summer mornings have: sharp, light, cool air, the smell of pine so strong it felt like something you could drink. Clara was at the table with her summary when she heard Holt come through the front door faster than his usual pace. She looked up. His face told her before his words did. "2 riders," he said. "Coming up from the south, still a mile out, moving slow and deliberate." Clara stood. "Stafford's. Can't say for certain. But they didn't take the main road. They came through the east meadow." He crossed the room and took the rifle from its hook and checked it with quick, practiced hands. "Nobody comes through the east meadow by accident." Clara moved to the fireplace and took the oilcloth packet from behind the stone. She looked at the bill, her written summary. 12 pages, still laid out. She gathered it, folded it, pushed it to the bottom of the canvas bag under her spare dress. The oilcloth packet she tucked back behind the stone. Separate locations. If they took the bag, they didn't get the originals. If they found the originals, they didn't get the summary. "Clara." She turned. "Can you get to the back room without being seen from the window?" "Yes." "Then go." She looked at him. "I'm not hiding in a back room while—" "I'm not asking you to hide," he said. "I'm asking you to be somewhere they don't know you are when they walk through that door. There's a difference." He held her gaze. "If they're here for you, I don't want them to see you the moment they arrive. I want to know what they want before they know what we have." She thought about it for 3 seconds. It was sound strategy, and she knew it. She picked up the canvas bag and moved to the back room and left the door open 2 inches enough to hear everything enough to see the front room if she positioned herself right. She heard Holt move a chair, set down his coffee cup, go back to whatever he'd been doing before to all appearances. She heard the horses arrive in the yard, 2 of them. She heard voices outside, one higher, one lower, and then boots on the porch steps and a knock on the door that was too sharp to be friendly and too controlled to be hostile. Holt opened it. "Morning," said the higher voice. "You Calloway?" "I am," Holt said. Easy, unhurried. "Name's Dent. This is Harrow. We ride for Ellis Stafford." A pause that was meant to land with some weight. "We're looking for a woman came through Delwood yesterday morning. Deaf girl, young dark hair, carrying a canvas bag. We heard a man from these parts took her on." "Heard from who?" Holt said. A brief silence. They hadn't expected the question to come back at them. "People in town," Dent said. "It was a public street." "It was," Holt agreed. "What's your business with her?" "Mr. Stafford has an interest in locating her," Dent said. "She left Delwood with some property that doesn't belong to her." Clara pressed her back against the wall of the back room and kept her breathing even. "What kind of property?" Holt said. "Private business documents. She worked for a man who worked for Mr. Stafford. Seems she helped herself to some papers when she left." Another pause. "If you've got her up here, Mr. Stafford would appreciate her return, and yours would be a grateful man." "What does a grateful Stafford look like?" Holt said. Dent's voice shifted slightly, warmer, more practiced. "Well now, that boundary dispute you've got on your east pasture. Mr. Stafford has considerable influence with the county land office. He might be persuaded to withdraw the competing claim, save you a long legal fight." Clara closed her eyes for 1 second. There it was. The offer. The same offer he'd made to 3 other families she knew of. The settlement that wasn't a settlement. Take the carrot, give him what he wants, and then watch the carrot turn into a leash. "I appreciate the offer," Holt said. His voice was completely level. "But I don't have a deaf girl up here. Dropped her at the fork in the road south of the property. She said she was heading toward Harker Crossing." A long pause. "You sure about that?" Harrow said. First time the second man had spoken. His voice was flatter than Dent's, more careful. "I'm sure about what I saw," Holt said. Another pause. Clara heard one of them shift their weight on the porch. She heard something else too, the specific silence of men deciding whether they believed what they'd just been told, which was a different kind of silence from ordinary quiet. "All right," Dent said finally. "If you see her, Mr. Stafford would be grateful for a message sent to Roanoke Flats." "I'll keep that in mind," Holt said. The boots went back down the porch steps. She heard the horses move in the yard, heard them go south, and she stood in the back room and counted to 60 before she moved. She came out to find Holt standing at the front window watching the yard. "They'll go as far as the trail bend," he said quietly. "Then they'll stop and watch the property for a while." "I know," she said. "How long before they believe you?" "They don't believe me," he said. "They just don't have enough certainty to push harder yet." He turned from the window. "But Dent will send word to Stafford today. By tomorrow Stafford knows I lied. By the day after that he sends more than 2 men." Clara set the canvas bag on the table. "Breck is 4 days out, at minimum." She looked at him. "Then we've got a problem." "We've had a problem since Delwood," he said. "This one just has a clearer shape now." She almost smiled at that. Almost. They spent the rest of the second day preparing. Not in the panicked way that fear produces, but in the deliberate, methodical way that comes from 2 people who have both separately spent their lives solving problems with limited resources and have learned that panic is a luxury neither of them could afford. Clara finished the written summary and made a second copy in a smaller hand on thinner paper. 1 copy in the canvas bag. 1 copy she gave to Holt, who folded it inside his riding coat without comment. Holt spent an hour on the roof of the barn with a sightline to the southern trail. He came back down with information about where a man could watch the property without being seen from the house, and they talked through what to do if someone approached from that direction at night. They worked close to each other for hours without speaking more than was necessary, and Clara noticed that this was not uncomfortable. She had lived in Roy's house for 3 years, and the silence there had always been a thing to navigate, loaded, unpredictable, capable of shifting without warning. This silence was different. It was a working silence. A silence between two people who were thinking about the same problem from different angles and trusted the other one to do their part. She didn't examine that feeling too closely. She had learned not to trust feelings that arrived fast. That evening after supper, he poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat down on his side of the table and said, "Tell me about your mother." It was not what she expected. She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup, not at her, which she understood was deliberate, giving her the choice of whether to answer without the pressure of being watched while she made it. Her name was Helen, Clara said. She was from Kentucky originally. She was the kind of woman who could read a land contract and argue it in a county office, and then come home and make dinner and not tell anyone what she'd done that day, because she didn't think it required announcing. She paused. She was the most capable person I've ever known. Roy married her because he liked capable women, and then spent the next 10 years resenting her for it. Holt said nothing. She fought the debt claim for 2 years, Clara said. She knew the law. She argued the filing dates, the interest calculations, everything. She was right on every point. It didn't matter. She wrapped both hands around her cup. The county judge was the kind of judge who had a pleasant dinner with men like Creighton every other week. The law was exactly what those men needed it to be, and nothing else. She lost the land, Holt said. She lost the land, and then she died, and I was 16 years old in Roy's house, with no money and no prospects, and a very clear understanding of how the system worked. She looked up. Which is exactly why I copied those documents the moment I understood what they were. Because my mother spent 2 years arguing the right way and lost everything. I decided I'd rather fight dirty and win. Holt looked at her then, directly. "That's not dirty," he said. "That's just smart." She looked back at him. Something passed between them that was not romantic exactly, or not only that, but was something more primary than romance. Recognition. The specific, rare recognition of a person who has been alone for a long time in a particular way. Meeting another person who has been alone for a long time in the same particular way. She looked away first. "Why are you alone out here?" she said. 11 years is a long time. A pause. "I had a wife," he said. Clara waited. "Sarah." He said the name carefully, the way you say a name you've been keeping in a specific place, and don't take out often. "She died in '69. Fever that second hard winter. We'd only been on this property 2 years. He was quiet for a moment. "My son was 4. He went to her sister's family in Missouri. Better for him than a mountain ranch with a father who—" He stopped. "Who what?" Clara said quietly. "Who wasn't any good to anyone for a long time after," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. "He's 15 now," Holt said. "Daniel, he writes sometimes. Good kid, smarter than me." "Do you see him?" "Not enough," he said. It was the flattest, most honest thing he'd said, and it landed accordingly. Clara looked at her coffee. She thought about a man building a smaller and smaller operation year by year, reducing himself to the minimum, running cattle alone on a mountain and coming to town 4 times a year for supplies and not for conversation. She thought about what that kind of grief looks like from the outside. Solid, functional, a hinge that works fine, and what it costs on the inside. She thought about her mother, about Helen Weston, who had been right about everything and still lost. "We're going to win this," Clara said. Holt looked at her. "I don't say that lightly," she said. "I've watched the right people lose for the wrong reasons my entire life, and I am not doing it again." She met his eyes. "Breck will get here. The documents will hold. Stafford's going to find out that 68 land disputes don't disappear just because the woman he ran out of town was supposed to be deaf and harmless." Something in Holt's face shifted, not the almost smile from before, but something deeper. Something that had been very still for a very long time, and was now cautiously considering movement. "You're something, Clara Weston," he said quietly. "I'm something very angry," she said. which turns out to be useful. The third morning came hard and fast. She was still in her cot when she heard hoofbeats. Not 2 horses this time. More. She was up and dressed, and at the door of the back room before the sound fully registered, the rifle already in her hand, her mind already 3 steps ahead. Holt was at the window. 4 riders, he said, coming straight up the main road, not bothering with the East Meadow this time. They're not asking anymore, she said. No, he said. They're not. She moved to his side and looked. 4 riders moving at a pace that was deliberate and unhurried in the way that confidence is unhurried. Men who believed the outcome was already settled and were just coming to collect it. The one in front was larger than the others, better dressed, the kind of man who wore his authority on the outside where people could see it. That's not Dent, she said. No, Holt said. That's a different kind of trouble. He turned from the window. Here's what's going to happen. They're going to come to the door. They're going to be polite about it for about 2 minutes. Then they're going to stop being polite. He looked at her. I need you behind me and to the left. Not hidden. Present. Why present? Because they already know you're here, he said. Pretending otherwise just makes us look like we're afraid. She understood the logic. She also understood something else the moment she stepped into that room. She was no longer the deaf girl nobody paid attention to. She was a woman who had something they wanted standing in a room with 1 man between her and 4 of them, and whatever happened next was going to happen on the record. All right, she said. The knock on the door was different from Dent's, slower, more deliberate. Holt opened it. The man in front was perhaps 50 broad through the chest, with a face that had been handsome once and had settled into something harder and more authoritative with age. He was not Stafford. Clara knew Stafford's description from the documents, and this wasn't it, but he had the look of a man who reported to Stafford and had been given considerable latitude. Calloway, he said. Not a greeting, an identification. That's right, Holt said. The man's eyes moved past Holt and found Clara. He looked at her with the particular assessing look of someone recalibrating based on new information. Miss Weston, he said. Clara said nothing. My name is Aldrin. I'm Mr. Stafford's legal representative for the Colorado Territory. He had a lawyer's voice, smooth, unhurried, designed to make unreasonable things sound like reasonable ones. I've come to discuss the return of some documents that belong to Mr. Stafford's business interests. Documents belonging to Stafford would be in Stafford's office, Holt said. Nothing here belongs to him. Aldrin smiled patiently. Mr. Calloway, I'm sure you understand that harboring stolen property creates a legal exposure that— Nothing here is stolen, Clara said. Aldrin looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. She had spoken, which told him the deaf story was finished, which told him more than he'd come here knowing. Miss Weston, he said carefully. You're an intelligent woman, I can see that. So I'll speak plainly. He paused, giving the pause the weight of a man who believed his pauses mattered. The documents you took from Delwood were obtained without authorization from private business records. Their contents are proprietary. Whatever you believe they show, I assure you that our legal team has already prepared documentation that will contextualize every transaction in a manner that is entirely lawful. I'm sure they have, Clara said. Does that documentation also contextualize the payment made to County Clerk Harmon on March 14th of last year, 3 days before the fraudulent survey filing on the Millward property in Lake County? Because the transfer amount and the filing date are both in what I have. Mr. Aldrin, and coincidences that specific tend to interest federal marshals. The silence on the porch was total. Aldrin's smooth expression didn't collapse, but it changed. Something moved behind his eyes that was not pleasant. I see, he said. I imagine you do, Clara said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Holt. Then back at her. He was recalculating. She could see it happening, the reassessment of what he'd walked into versus what he'd thought he was walking into. Miss Weston, he said finally. His voice slightly different now. The smoothness still there, but with something under it. I want you to think carefully about your situation. You are a woman without legal standing, without property, without— Without anything left to lose, Clara said. Yes. Roy Weston sold me on a public street for $20 3 days ago. I've been aware of my situation for some time. Aldrin said nothing, which means, Clara continued, keeping her voice completely level, that the threat you just started to make doesn't work. What are you going to take from me? My reputation in Delwood. She held his gaze. The documents exist. I've made copies. Those copies are in more than one place, and a federal marshal named Breck out of Denver is already in contact and already moving. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. So what Mr. Stafford needs to consider very carefully is what it looks like when a federal investigation opens, and the first thing Marshal Breck finds is evidence that Mr. Stafford sent 4 men to intimidate a witness. Aldrin looked at her for a very long time. We'll be in touch, he said. We'll be here, Holt said. Aldrin turned and walked back to his horse. The 3 men behind him followed without a word. Clara and Holt stood in the doorway and watched them ride south. When they were out of earshot, Holt said quietly, Harmon, March 14th, Lake County. Yes, she said. You said that because you knew it would land. I said it because it's true, and because he needed to understand that what I have is specific. She stepped back inside. He'll wire Stafford within the hour. Stafford will know by tomorrow morning that I named a specific clerk with a specific date and a specific county. And then what? Holt said. And then Stafford has a choice, she said. He can push harder, which creates more evidence of intimidation. Or he can pull back and try to get ahead of the investigation legally. She looked at Holt. Either way, we've changed the shape of the problem. He came here thinking he was collecting stolen property from a deaf girl with no resources. He's leaving knowing he walked into something he didn't understand. Holt looked at her with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the one he got when she'd said something that landed somewhere real. How are you this calm? He said. I'm not calm, she said. I'm focused. There's a difference. She went to the table and sat down and picked up her pen, and her hand was completely steady. She was not calm. Her heart was hitting her ribs hard enough to feel in her back teeth, and her hands would shake the moment she let them. And there was a cold, specific fear living in her chest that had been there since the moment she'd copied those first documents in Delwood, and understood that she had just made herself into something dangerous. But she had been carrying that fear for 14 months. She had learned to work with it instead of against it. She had learned to use it the way her mother had used anger, clean, controlled, pointed at the problem. She picked up the pen and kept writing. Outside, the summer afternoon settled over the foothills, and the mountains stood where they had always stood. And somewhere south on the road toward Roanoke Flats, Aldrin rode hard, with a message that was going to change Ella Stafford's morning in a way that Ella Stafford was not going to enjoy. She had 4 days until Breck arrived. She had copies in 2 locations. She had a man beside her who had not blinked once in the last hour. And she had 14 months of fury, carefully organized and clearly written, waiting to be placed in the hands of the one person in the Colorado Territory, with the authority to do something about it. 4 days, she thought. Just 4 more days. She kept writing. The 4th day started wrong. Clara knew it before she opened her eyes. Something in the quality of the morning, the way the ranch was too quiet, the horses in the pasture not moving, the way they usually moved, told her that the world outside had shifted while she slept. She was up and dressed before Holt knocked on the back room door. Ryder came through an hour ago, he said when she opened it. While you were still asleep. I didn't wake you. Who? Name's Garrett. Pete Garrett. He runs the small operation 2 miles east of here. Known him 8 years. Holt's jaw was set in a way she hadn't seen before. He came to warn me. Said there were 6 men camped at the south end of the valley last night. Not Stafford's usual riders. Different men. Harder men. Clara absorbed that. 6 men. The number Aldrin had decided was appropriate after their conversation 2 days ago. When did they arrive? Yesterday evening. Pete saw their fire from his upper pasture. Holt poured her coffee and set it on the table. He also said one of them was asking questions in Harker Crossing the day before. About the telegraph office. About who'd been sending wires. Her stomach dropped. They know about Breck. They know someone sent a wire south, Holt said. "Whether they know who received it." He stopped. "It doesn't matter," Clara said. "If they know a wire went out, they know we have contact with someone. That changes Stafford's timeline." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "He can't wait for a legal solution anymore. He needs the documents before Breck arrives, and he needs them in the next—" She looked at Holt. "When did Pete say Breck was due?" "I told Pete 2 days, maybe less." "Then Stafford has today and tomorrow," she said. "After that, a federal marshal with 2 deputies and a documented case lands on his doorstep, and the legal maneuvers stop working." She set down the cup. "He's going to move today, Holt." "I know," Holt said. 6 men isn't a conversation." "No," he said. "It's not." They looked at each other across the table. 3 days ago, she had been a woman nobody in Delwood could name without adding the word deaf in front of it. Now she was sitting in a mountain ranch kitchen calculating how many hours they had before Ellis Stafford's hired men came through the door, and the distance between those 2 versions of her life felt both enormous and completely logical, like a river that had always been moving toward this particular place. "Pete Garrett," she said. "Can he be trusted? Trusted how far? Trusted to carry a package to the South Road and hand it to a federal marshal without opening it or talking about it?" Holt thought for exactly 3 seconds. "Yes. Then we need to split the evidence," she said. She was already moving to the fireplace. "The originals stay here. If they come and search the property, let them find the originals. Those are copies anyway. I made copies in Delwood before I took these, left them with a woman there who doesn't know what she's holding." She pulled the oilcloth packet from behind the stone. "But the written summary, the one Breck can actually use in court without spending 3 weeks in the documents that goes with Pete. Now, before those 6 men break camp." Holt was already on the door. "I'll get him back here." "Holt." He stopped. "Don't go to his property. If they're watching a man riding east this morning means something. Send a signal you 2 have used before. Something ordinary." He looked at her for a moment. 3 years alone on this mountain," he said quietly. "And you understand how I think better than people who've known me a decade." "I've been reading People for Survival since I was 12, she said. "Go." Pete Garrett was back at the ranch within 40 minutes, which told Clara things about the man before he said a word. He was perhaps 60, weathered and compact, with the hands of someone who had been working difficult land for a long time, and the eyes of someone who had decided to be honest about what those years had cost him. He came in, took the coffee Holt offered, sat down, and looked at Clara with a directness she appreciated. "Holt says you're the woman who came out of Delwood," he said. "I am," she said. "He says you've got documentation that'll take down Ellis Stafford." "I have." Pete nodded slowly. "Stafford's men filed a competing claim on my north fence line last spring," he said. 12 acres. I didn't fight it because I couldn't afford to." He looked at his coffee. "Those 12 acres have the only reliable water source on my property above the summer dry line." Clara held his gaze. "Your name isn't in what I have specifically, but the method is identical to what happened to you. When the federal investigation opens, your claim will be part of the pattern." "Pattern's enough for a court." "Pattern plus documented payments to clerks, plus false survey filings, plus 68 other cases across 4 counties. She nodded. "Yes, that's enough." Pete was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Holt. "What do you need me to do?" Holt nodded at Clara. This was hers to direct. She placed the folded summary, both copies, inside an oilskin envelope she'd sewn shut the night before with thread from her hem. "You ride south, not the main road. The creek trail on the west side of the valley. Slower, but less visible." She set the envelope on the table in front of him. 2 days out, maybe less, you'll meet a federal marshal named Breck coming north with 2 deputies. He'll identify himself. You give him this, and you tell him the situation at the Calloway ranch. You tell him to move faster than planned." Pete picked up the envelope without ceremony and put it inside his coat. "And if Stafford's men stop me on the road—" "You're a rancher going to sell a horse in Harker Crossing," Holt said, "which you've done 4 times this year. And the envelope is inside your boot," Clara said, "not your coat." Pete looked at her. Then he moved the envelope. "I was gone in 10 minutes." Clara watched from the window until the trail curved and took him from view, and then she turned back to the room and to Holt, who was standing with his arms crossed, looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man taking stock. "What are the chances those 6 men let him pass?" he said. "Good," she said. "They're not looking for Pete. They're coming here." She looked at Holt. "Which is what we need them to do." He looked at her. "Explain." "If they come here, they're not following Pete. Every man Stafford sends to this ranch is a man who isn't on the South Road." She met his eyes. "We need to keep them here, Holt. Keep their attention on this property for as long as possible." "You're using us as bait," he said. "I'm using us as bait," she confirmed. A long pause. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They didn't have to wait long. The 6 men came up the main road at mid-morning, not bothering with the East Meadow approach this time. 2 of them peeled off and went around the east side of the property before the others reached the door covering the back exit, which told Clara these men had done this before and had been told specifically what they were dealing with. The remaining 4 came to the door. No knock this time. The door opened because the man in front tried the handle and found it unlocked. Holt had left it unlocked deliberately, and the 4 of them came inside with the particular casual confidence of men who had been given permission by someone powerful to do what they were about to do. Holt was sitting at the table. Clara was standing at the far end of the kitchen. The rifle was on its hook. She had decided, and Holt had agreed, that reaching for it would change the nature of the encounter in a direction they couldn't control, with 2 men on the back of the property. So she stood with her hands visible and her face still, and she used the 3 years of practice she had, and she showed them nothing. The man in front was not Aldrin. He was younger and considerably less polished, with the flat eyes of someone who had been hired for a specific quality he possessed, and that quality was not conversation. "Miss Weston," he said. "My name is Cord. I work for Mr. Stafford." He looked around the room with a slow, deliberate sweep. "We're going to need you to come with us." "No," Clara said. Cord looked at her with mild surprise, as if the word was one he hadn't expected in this context. "Miss Weston." "No," she said again. "I'm not going anywhere with you." She kept her voice completely level. "And before you explain to me why I don't have a choice, you should know that a federal marshal named Breck is currently moving north from Pueblo with 2 deputies and documentation that your employer sent armed men to intimidate a witness in a federal fraud investigation." Cord was quiet for a moment. "Whatever Mr. Stafford told you about what I have," Clara said, "he told you wrong. I don't have documents that belong to him. I have copies of documents that prove criminal fraud across 4 counties. Those copies are no longer on this property." She held his gaze. "You can search every inch of this ranch, and you will find the originals which I kept here because I wanted you to find something. The originals are useless to you because the copies are already moving south." The silence in the room was the kind that has physical weight. Cord looked at Holt. Holt looked back at him with an expression that contained no information whatsoever. Cord looked back at Clara. "You're bluffing," he said. "I've been planning this for 14 months, she said. "I don't bluff." One of the men behind Cord shifted his weight. Cord held up one hand without looking back, a gesture that said wait, and kept his eyes on Clara. "Even if what you're saying is true," he said carefully, "you're still here, and we're still here, and Mr. Stafford would like this resolved before it becomes something that's difficult to manage." "It's already something difficult to manage," Clara said. "That's the point." Cord looked at her for a long time. She could see him working through it, the variables, the instructions he'd been given, the gap between what he'd expected to walk into and what he'd actually found. A deaf girl with nothing versus a woman who had clearly been several steps ahead of everyone in this situation for longer than anyone had realized. "Search the property," he said finally without taking his eyes off her. 2 of his men moved through the room. Go through the crate of records, now reorganized, but containing nothing incriminating, and check the fireplace, and find the oilcloth packet behind the stone exactly where she'd left it. One of them brought it to Cord. Cord opened it. He read the first page. He read the second. His expression did not change, but something in his posture did a slight easing the body language of a man who believes he has found what he came for. "This is everything," he said. "That's everything on the property," Clara said truthfully. Cord refolded the packet. "Then we're done here." He looked at Holt. "Mr. Stafford's boundary claim on your east pasture will be withdrawn. Consider it a gesture of goodwill." He turned toward the door. "Cord," Clara said. He stopped. "Those documents you just picked up," she said. "They're the originals of copies that are currently riding south inside a federal courier's boot. When Marshal Breck arrives and opens his case, the first thing on record will be that you came here with 6 men, searched this property without a warrant, and removed documents relevant to a federal investigation." She paused. "That's called evidence tampering, in a federal case, which is a separate crime from everything Stafford has already done." Cord turned around slowly. "You can put them back," she said. "Or you can take them and add your name and the names of these 5 men to a federal case that's going to dismantle Ellis Stafford's operation from the ground up." She held his gaze. "Your choice. You've got about 10 seconds before it stops being one." The room was absolutely still. Cord looked at the packet in his hand. He looked at Clara. He looked at Holt, who said nothing and simply looked back with that expression that contained nothing aggressive and nothing warm, and was somehow considerably more threatening than either. Cord set the packet on the table. "We're leaving," he said. He walked out. His men followed. Clara heard the horses in the yard, heard them move south, and she stood in the kitchen and held herself perfectly still until the sound faded completely. Then her knees tried to go. She grabbed the edge of the table with both hands and locked them and kept standing. Holt was beside her in 2 steps. He didn't reach for her, he just stood close enough that if she needed something solid, it was there. "You knew he'd put it back," he said quietly. "I thought he would," she said. "There's a difference." "Clara." She looked up. "You're shaking," he said. "I know," she said. "Give me a minute." He gave her the minute. He stood beside her and didn't say anything and didn't move away, and she breathed in and breathed out and let her hands stop shaking at their own pace, which took about 90 seconds. And when they stopped, she straightened up and picked up the oilcloth packet from the table and returned it to the fireplace. 14 months, Holt said. 14 months, she agreed. "And you had the whole thing mapped out." "Not the whole thing," she said. "I didn't map out Roy selling me in the street. I didn't map out you." She looked at him. "Some of this has been improvised." Something moved across his face. "You're the most dangerous person I've ever met," he said. "And I used to scout for the cavalry." She looked at him for a moment. "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation," he said. "The compliment is that I'm glad you're on this side of the problem." She felt something warm move through the cold in her chest. She filed it away carefully, the way she filed everything for later when there was time. The rest of the afternoon was a different kind of waiting. Not the coiled, high-alert waiting of this morning, but the flatter, more exhausting waiting that comes after a crisis has passed, and the body starts tallying what the mind was too busy to notice during it. Clara felt the tiredness in her shoulders first, then in her hands, then behind her eyes. She was working through the files again, looking for anything she might have missed, any gap in the chain of evidence that Stafford's lawyers could use to create doubt, when Holt came in from outside and sat down across from her and said without preamble, "I need to tell you something." She looked up. "Pete Garrett," he said. "He's a good man, but he's not the only person who knew I'd sent a wire from Harker Crossing." Clara set down her pen. "The man I used at the telegraph office," Holt said. "Name's Vickers. I've known him 6 years. I trusted him." He stopped. "Pete told me this morning before you came out. He didn't want to say it in front of me directly. But Vickers has been doing occasional work for Stafford's land agent for the past year, passing information from the telegraph. Small things, Pete said, but enough." The room was very quiet. "Vickers knew you sent a wire to Denver," Clara said. "Yes. And Stafford's people knew about the wire before Aldrin came here." "Yes." "Which means Aldrin's visit wasn't a response to what I said to Cord's men," she said slowly. "It was planned before that. They already knew Breck was in contact. Yes, Holt said. She absorbed this, rearranged the sequence of events in her mind, running it forward again with this new piece in place. So when Cord came this morning and I told him Breck was moving north, he already knew, Holt said. Or he suspected, which is why he had 6 men instead of 2. And why they were camped in the valley last night, she said. They weren't waiting to see what we'd do. They were waiting for the right time to move. She looked at Holt. Which means Stafford's already made a decision. He's not trying to negotiate anymore. No, Holt said. He's trying to stop the case before it reaches Breck. Cord left without the documents, she said. Cord left without the documents, Holt agreed. But Cord also went south, same direction as Pete. The cold came back into her chest. How long ago did Pete leave? 3 hours. She was on her feet before she finished the calculation. We need to warn him. The creek trail is faster on horseback but narrower, Holt said. He was already moving. If Stafford's men know the routes. They know the routes, she said. Vickers would have told them. She was already at the door. How far ahead is Pete? 3 hours at his pace. Holt had the horses ready in the time it took most men to find their boots. He brought hers alongside and held it steady, and this time she was up before he'd finished settling his own animal, and they went down the trail at a pace the horses set themselves because they could feel the urgency in the hands holding the reins. They took the creek trail, moving fast through the narrow sections and faster through the open ones, and Clara rode like she'd been doing it all her life, which she had, and Holt rode like a man who had once covered serious ground under serious pressure, which he also had, and they didn't speak because speaking would have cost speed. They didn't have to spare. 40 minutes down the trail, Holt pulled up hard. Clara pulled up beside him. Ahead around the bend in the creek trail, she heard voices. 2 of them. Then Pete Garrett's voice, sharp and defensive. Then silence. Holt looked at her. She was already off the horse. She moved through the trees along the creek bank on foot, fast and quiet, the way she'd moved through Roy's house for 3 years when she didn't want to be found. She came around the bend in time to see Pete Garrett on horseback, 2 men blocking the trail in front of him, one of them holding Pete's horse by the bridle. Not Cord's men, different riders. Stafford had more than one group in the field. Pete's face was controlled, but his hands were tight on the reins. One of the men, shorter with a hat pulled low, was saying something Clara couldn't fully hear. Pete was shaking his head. She looked back at Holt, who had come up behind her. She held up 2 fingers. He nodded once and moved left through the trees without a sound, which was impressive for a man his size. She gave him 30 seconds. Then she stepped out onto the trail. Pete, she said clearly. All 4 of them looked at her. The 2 men who were blocking Pete's horse took a moment to recalibrate. A woman had just appeared on the trail where no woman was expected, which created a half-second gap between reaction and action that was exactly what she needed. I believe you have something of mine, she said to the shorter man. He hadn't touched Pete yet. He looked at her with the expression of someone deciding whether this was a complication or an opportunity. Miss Weston, he said. My name is Clara Weston, she said. I have documentation of 68 fraudulent land filings across 4 counties, by Ellis Stafford payments to 3 identified county clerks and a chain of financial transactions going back to 1874. That documentation is currently in multiple locations. You are standing in a creek bed in Colorado territory, attempting to interfere with a federal investigation, and there is a federal marshal named Breck, currently moving north, who is going to want to know the names of the men who did that. The shorter man stared at her. I also want you to notice, she said, that the man who was riding behind me 2 minutes ago is no longer visible. Both men looked at the tree line. Holt stepped out of the trees on the left side of the trail with a rifle held easy and level. The shorter man looked back at Clara. He did the arithmetic. It didn't take him long. He released Pete's horse. Ride, Clara said to Pete. Pete didn't need to be told twice. He moved his horse south at a pace that communicated very clearly that he intended to keep moving until the mountains were behind him. Clara watched him go, and then she looked at the 2 men on the trail, and she said very clearly and very quietly, Tell Mr. Stafford that the documents are already past him. Tell him the case is already moving. And tell him that what happens next is up to him and his lawyers. But the time for sending men to mountain ranches is finished. She turned and walked back toward the horses. Holt fell in beside her, and neither of them said anything until the trail had put a solid quarter-mile between them and the creek bed. "That was close," he said. "Yes," she said. "Pete's going to make it." "Yes," she said. "You're shaking again," he said. "I know," she said. "Still give me a minute." I gave her the minute. He rode beside her through the pines and didn't say anything and didn't pull ahead, and she breathed in and breathed out and let the shaking pass the same way it had passed before. When it did, she said, "Vickers." "Yes," Holt said. "You trusted him 6 years." "Yes." She looked at the trail. "It's not your fault," she said. I was quiet for a moment. "I know whose fault it is," he said, and the flatness in his voice when he said it told her that he'd moved through whatever he needed to move through about Vickers and had come out the other side in a particular kind of cold clarity. "When Breck arrives," she said, "Vickers needs to be in the statement." "He'll be in the statement," Holt said. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon light. The mountains held the day longer up here than they did in the valley below. The sun was already gone from Delwood, but still sitting on the western peaks when they came through the gate and put the horses in the barn and went inside. The kitchen was exactly as they'd left it, the oilcloth packet behind the stone, the crate of records in the corner, the 2 coffee cups still on the table from that morning. Clara sat down. She was more tired than she'd been since Delwood, a specific kind of tired that lived in the bones rather than the muscles, the tiredness of someone who has been running on calculation and controlled fear for 4 days and has finally used up the last of the reserve. Holt put water on and sat down across from her. "2 more days," she said. "At most," he said. "Stafford's out of moves," she said. "He can't intercept Pete now. He can't take the documents because Cord already proved that pulling them constitutes evidence tampering. His legal team is going to be drafting defenses instead of offenses from this point forward." "Does that mean it's over?" Holt said. "It means the worst of it is over," she said. "The court part is going to take time, months, maybe more, but the moment Breck has that envelope, Ellis Stafford stops being a man who is ahead of everyone. He becomes a man with a federal case building against him." She looked at Holt. "Your east pasture, the 12 acres Pete lost, the 68 families across 4 counties. All of that starts moving in the right direction the moment Breck reads that summary." Holt nodded. He was looking at her with that expression again, the deep one, the one that had been very still for a long time, and was now doing something unfamiliar. "Clara," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. He stopped. "Not yet," she said. "When this is finished. When Breck is here and the statement is signed and the case is moving, then." She met his eyes. "I need to finish one thing before I start another. That's how I work." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. Outside, the last of the summer light left the peaks and the mountains went dark and the stars came out over the foothills. One at a time, the way they do at altitude, brighter and closer than they have any right to be. The creek ran. The horses settled in the barn. The ranch sat quiet on its piece of mountain ground and held the 2 people inside it, the way solid things hold the things placed carefully within them, somewhere south on the creek trail. Pete Garrett rode hard through the dark with an envelope inside his boot, and the particular focused urgency of a man who understood that what he was carrying was larger than himself. And somewhere north, still moving, still coming, was the man who was going to make all of it matter. 2 more days. Just 2 more days. Marshal Breck arrived on the afternoon of the 5th day. He came with 2 deputies and a face that looked like it had heard every version of every story and was prepared to be unimpressed until proven otherwise. He was perhaps 55, lean with gray at his temples and the particular economy of movement that belongs to men who have spent decades doing difficult work in difficult places. He stepped down from his horse in the yard, looked at the ranch with one long sweep, and then looked at Clara standing in the doorway. "Miss Weston," he said. "Marshal," she said. Pete Garrett found me a day ahead of schedule, he said. Rode through the night from what I understand. He's a good man, she said. He is. Breck came up the porch steps. He also told me you faced down 6 armed men with nothing but a name and an argument. I had the argument, Clara said. Holt had the rifle. Breck looked past her at Holt, who was standing in the kitchen doorway. They exchanged the nod of men who understood each other's particular kind of work without needing to discuss it. Let's sit down, Breck said. I want to hear everything from the beginning. Not Pete's version, yours. They sat at the kitchen table, Clara, Holt, Breck, and one deputy named Callum, who took notes in a small book with a focused, unhurried hand. The other deputy stayed outside, which Clara understood was not casual. Breck had positioned his people before he came through the door. He'd been doing this a long time. Clara talked for 90 minutes. She laid it out the way she'd written it, chronological, specific, each piece of evidence connected to the next by date and transaction and documented fact. She did not editorialize. She did not use the word evil or criminal or any other word that was an interpretation rather than a fact. She stated what she had seen and copied and verified, and she let the chain of evidence do the work her mother had always said it should do if you built it right. When she finished, the room was quiet. Breck looked at the oilcloth packet. He had read through it while she talked, cross-referencing her words against the documents, with a speed that told her he'd been working this territory longer than she'd known. Clerk Harmon, he said. March 14th. Yes. I've had Harmon on a separate matter for 8 months, Breck said. Couldn't connect him to anything large enough to move on. He set down the packet. This connects him. To Stafford directly, Holt said. To the holding company which connects to Stafford through 3 transactions I already have documented on my end. Breck looked at Clara. You knew about the holding company. I noted it in the summary, she said. You noted it correctly. He said this the way a careful man states something that has surprised him, plainly, without embellishment, but with full acknowledgement of the weight. Miss Weston, where did you learn to build an evidence chain like this? My mother taught me land law, she said. She lost a case she should have won because the evidence wasn't organized well enough for the court to follow it quickly. I decided if I ever had a case to make, no one was going to lose it because the paperwork was confusing. Breck looked at her for a moment. Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was, Clara said. She was also right about everything, and it didn't save her. She held his gaze. Which is why I need to know that right and documented and clearly argued is enough this time. Because if it isn't, I need to know what else I have to do. Breck set his hands flat on the table. It's enough, he said. I'm freezing Stafford's filings across all 4 counties effective tomorrow morning. The federal case opens formally when I wire Denver tonight. He paused. This is going to be a long process. Court proceedings, depositions, appeals. Stafford has money and lawyers, and he's going to use both. I know, Clara said. You'll need to give a formal deposition, possibly testify. I know. It means staying in the territory, potentially for months. Clara looked at the table, then at Holt. He said nothing. He was giving her the space to answer for herself, which she understood and was grateful for. I'll stay, she said. Breck nodded once. Then we have a case. The formal business took the rest of the afternoon and most of the evening. Breck's deputy Callum transcribed Clara's full statement, while Breck himself catalogued every document in the oilcloth packet, creating an official inventory that would become part of the federal record. Holt gave his own statement about the boundary dispute, the visits from Aldrin and Cord, the 6 men in the valley. Clara added Vickers to the record, Holt's name, for the telegraph man who had been feeding information to Stafford's operation, and watched Breck write it down with the particular satisfaction of a piece clicking into place. At some point, Holt made food. Clara didn't track when. She was aware at a distance of the smell of coffee and the sound of the stove, and at some point, a plate appeared beside her, and she ate without stopping the process of going through the documents with Breck for the 3rd time. When it was finally done, when every page was catalogued and every statement transcribed, and Breck had folded everything into his official satchel with the careful, deliberate hands of a man who understood what he was carrying, Clara sat back in her chair and felt the full weight of 14 months' release from somewhere behind her sternum. It didn't feel the way she'd imagined it would. She had imagined it would feel like winning. It felt more like setting down something very heavy that she had been carrying so long she'd forgotten it had a weight. Breck stood and put on his hat. He looked at Clara with an expression that was not warm exactly. He was not a warm man, but was something adjacent to respect, which from him seemed to mean more. "I'll be in touch within the week," he said. "Stay reachable." "I will," she said. High and his deputies left. The yard went quiet. The door closed. Clara and Holt were alone in the kitchen with the remains of supper and the empty chairs where 3 federal officials had been sitting an hour ago, and the silence was so complete and so different from every silence of the past 5 days that it had an almost physical texture. Holt poured 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of her and sat down on his side of the table. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. "It's done," he said. "The first part is done," she said. "The court part is still ahead." "But the worst of it?" "Yes," she said. "The worst of it is done." He nodded. He looked at his coffee cup. She looked at hers. The fire in the stove had burned low, and the kitchen was warm in the particular good way that kitchens get warm in summer evenings, when the day has finally released its heat. "Holt," she said. He looked up. "You said you weren't any good to anyone for a long time after Sarah died," she said. He was still. "I've been watching you for 5 days," she said. "The way you managed this property when you thought it was going to be taken. The way you handled Cord's men. The way you rode hard through the creek trail without being asked." She kept her eyes on him. "You've been good to me every single day since you paid $20 for a woman you'd never met and asked nothing for it. That's not a man who isn't any good to anyone." Holt was quiet for a long time. "Clara," he said finally. His voice was lower than usual. "You said when this was finished," she said. "It's finished." Something moved through his face, the thing that had been considering movement for 5 days cautiously from a great distance. It arrived now slowly, the way something arrives that has been waiting a long time for the conditions to be right. "I don't know what I have to offer," he said. "This ranch, a man who's been alone 11 years and has gotten very set in." "Holt," she said. He stopped. "I grew up in a house where Roy Weston decided what everyone was worth and acted accordingly," she said. "I've been told my worth by every person in Delwood for 3 years. I know exactly what I'm looking at when I'm looking at it, and I know the difference between something real and something that just looks like it." She held his gaze. "You're something real." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, a gesture so simple and so deliberate that it said everything his careful, economical nature could not have said in words. She turned her hand over and held his. The next morning came, ordinary and bright, and that was the thing she hadn't expected, that after everything the world continued in its ordinary way. The horses needed water. The hens produced eggs. The creek ran the same speed it always ran. The mountains stood exactly where they had always been. Clara was at the table with coffee when Holt came in from the barn and said, "Pete Garrett's coming up the road." Alone. Alone. Pete came in with his hat in his hand and the particular expression of a man who has news that is both good and complicated. He sat down, took the coffee Holt offered, and looked at Clara. "Stafford's lawyer filed for an injunction in the county court this morning," he said, "trying to freeze Breck's federal filing on jurisdictional grounds." He paused. "The county judge is Alderman Price." Clara set down her cup. She knew that name. It was in her documents, not in the payments to county clerks. Price was too careful for direct payments, but in the record of rulings the pattern of decisions that had consistently favored Stafford's interests across 6 cases in 3 years. Circumstantial, but she had noted it. "Is Price in Breck's scope?" Holt said. "Not yet," Clara said. "He's on my list of probable involvement, but I couldn't document it directly. What I have is a pattern of rulings, not a transaction." "A pattern might be enough for Breck to flag him," Pete said. "It might," Clara said. "But Price ruling on the injunction before Breck can object to his involvement." She stopped, thought it through. How fast can the injunction be heard? Price set it for tomorrow morning, Pete said. 8 o'clock. That was fast. That was very fast. Price had been told to move quickly, which meant Stafford had reached him directly, probably within hours of Breck leaving the ranch last night. If Price grants the injunction, Clara said slowly. Breck's federal filing gets tangled in a jurisdictional fight for weeks. Stafford's filings don't freeze. The evidence sits in legal limbo, while Stafford's lawyers work every angle they can find. She looked at Pete. And Stafford uses those weeks to move whatever he can move before the federal case resolves. Which means the 68 families stay exposed, Clara said. Yes. The kitchen was very quiet. What do we do? Holt said. Clara looked at the table. She ran the arithmetic one more time, checking her own logic the way her mother had taught her to check it backwards, then forwards, then from the middle out. Breck needs to know about Price before 8 o'clock tomorrow, she said. If he can get a federal objection to Price's jurisdiction filed before the hearing opens, Price can't rule without it being immediately appealable to the federal level. That's a tight window, Pete said. How far is Breck from Harker Crossing right now? Clara said. Pete thought. He rode out of here heading south toward Harker Crossing to wire Denver. If he hasn't left Harker Crossing yet. I can make Harker Crossing in under 2 hours, Holt said. Clara looked at him. Go, she said. He was already standing. What do I tell him? Tell him Price, she said. Tell him tomorrow at 8. Tell him I have a pattern of rulings in my records. He needs to request the full case file from the county clerk in Lake County for the Millward case and the Parson case and the Dreyer case. The pattern is in those 3 decisions. And tell him to look at the dates. Price's rulings in all 3 cases came within 48 hours of a Stafford filing, which is faster than his normal case calendar by a significant margin. Holt absorbed this in the time it took most men to pick up a hat. I'll be back by dark, he said. He was gone in 4 minutes. Pete looked at Clara across the table. You had all that memorized, he said. The dates, the case names. I've been memorizing things no one expected me to remember for 3 years, she said. It's a useful habit when you're not supposed to be listening. Pete looked at her for a moment. Then he said very quietly, My wife told me when I came home yesterday that whatever woman was at the Calloway ranch must be something. She said it because of the way I came through the door. He paused. She was right. Clara looked at the table. Tell your wife thank you, she said. And tell her she's getting her 12 acres back. Holt came back before dark as promised. He came through the door with the particular energy of a man who had ridden hard and had something to show for it. Breck hadn't left Harker Crossing, he said. He was still at the telegraph office when I got there. He'd been wiring Denver for 2 hours. He poured water and drank it standing up. When I told him about Price and the 8 o'clock hearing, he stopped what he was doing and looked at me for about 5 seconds and then said, and I'm giving you his exact words, that woman is either going to save this territory or run it. Clara raised an eyebrow. What did you say? I said she's going to do both, Holt said. She looked at him for a moment. Something warm moved through her chest, the same thing that had been moving through her chest with increasing frequency over the past 5 days. The thing she had been carefully filing away for later and was now running out of later to file it into. Did he file the objection? She said. Wired it to the federal court in Denver at 5:47, Holt said. They'll have a response to Harker Crossing before 7 tomorrow morning. Price can't open that hearing without it being on the federal record that his jurisdiction is contested. He sat down across from her. Stafford's lawyers are going to have a very bad morning. Clara exhaled. A full, complete exhale, the kind that comes when the last variable has resolved. It holds, she said. It holds, he agreed. She closed her eyes for one moment. She saw her mother's face briefly. Helen Weston, at a county office table arguing land law to a judge who had already decided how he was going to rule. Fighting the right way and losing because the system had been arranged against her before she walked through the door. This time the system was being rearranged. One document at a time. One wire at a time. One careful, methodical 14-month argument at a time. She opened her eyes. Holt was watching her. "You're thinking about your mother," he said. "Yes," she said. What would she say? Clara thought about it. She thought about Helen Weston, who had been right about everything, and had still lost, who had taught her daughter land law and careful handwriting, and the importance of making an argument that stood on its own, without needing anyone to believe in the person making it. "She'd say the work isn't finished," Clara said. "And she'd be right." She looked at Holt. "But she'd also say it's moving in the right direction, and she never said that easily." He reached across the table and covered her hand again. She let him. Outside, the summer dark came down over the foothills, and the stars came out, and the ranch sat quiet and solid on its piece of mountain ground. Inside the kitchen, two people who had both spent a very long time being alone sat across a table from each other in the warm light of a low fire, and neither of them reached for more words than were necessary, because the necessary ones had already been said. 3 days later, the federal court in Denver denied Stafford's injunction. Breck's filing held. The freeze on Stafford's land filings across all 4 counties became official federal record. The county clerk in Lake County received a formal federal inquiry into 3 specific cases. Millward Parson Dreyer and Judge Alderman Price recused himself from any Stafford-related proceedings pending review, which was the quiet face-saving way that a man does what he is going to have to do anyway before someone makes him do it publicly. Clara received the news via Pete Garrett, who had become an informal courier between the ranch and Harker Crossing in the week since Breck's visit. She was at the table with the ranch records when Pete came through the door and handed her a folded wire from Breck, and she read it once and set it on the table and sat very still for a moment. Holt was watching her from across the room. "Well," he said. "It's done," she said. "The real done. The rest is court proceedings and depositions, and a very long legal process that is going to end the right way." He crossed the room and picked up the wire and read it. He set it back on the table. He looked at her. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said quietly. "You should be in Delwood right now," he said. "The whole town should know your name." She looked at the table. "Delwood watched Roy sell me in the street and did nothing," she said. "I don't need Delwood to know my name." "Then what do you need?" he said. She looked up at him. She thought about what she needed, which was a question she had not allowed herself to ask in a very long time, because the answer had always been too large and too unlikely to be useful. "I need to know if this place is mine too," she said. "Not because of the work I've done, not because of what I've given you, or what the case needed, or what's useful." She held his gaze. "I need to know if I belong here. If you want me here. Not as someone who passes through and moves on when the business is settled." Holt looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the table between them. At the records she'd organized, and the coffee cups and the oilcloth packets still sitting by the fireplace, and the cot in the back room, and the window where she'd stood watching his horse disappear down the trail when he went to Harker Crossing. "When I rode back from Harker Crossing the first time," he said, "and I came through those trees and saw the ranch and knew you were inside it." He stopped. "I understood something I hadn't understood in 11 years. "What?" she said. "That I'd been maintaining this place," he said. "Not living in it. There's a difference." He looked at her directly. "You made it a difference I could feel." She looked at him. She felt the thing behind her ribs that she had been filing away for later arrive all at once, complete and certain, and not frightening in the way she'd expected it to be. It felt more like recognition than anything new. Like something that had been true for a while and had simply been waiting for the right moment to be spoken. "Then I'm staying," she said. "Then you're staying," he said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the same gesture as before, simple and deliberate, and saying everything that his careful, economical nature had always communicated better through action than through words. She turned her hand over. She held on. Outside, the summer afternoon moved over the foothills, and the mountains stood where they had always stood, and the creek ran, and the horses moved along the fence line, and the ranch sat on its piece of mountain ground, exactly as it had sat for 11 years, but differently now. With a different quality to its stillness. With the particular fullness that a place gets when it is no longer being maintained, and has started finally to be lived in. Inside, Clara Weston sat across the table from Holt Calloway, and held his hand, and felt for the first time in as long as she could accurately remember that the place she was sitting was the place she was supposed to be. Not because Roy had sold her, and this was where she'd landed. Not because the case had needed her here, but because she had chosen it clearly and freely, with her eyes open and her name her own. That was the difference. That had always been the difference. The letter from the federal court in Denver arrived on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after Breck had ridden north with the oilcloth packet. Pete Garrett brought it up the trail himself, which told Clara something before she opened it. Pete only made the ride personally when the news was significant enough that he didn't want it sitting in the Harker Crossing office waiting to be collected. He came through the door with his hat in his hand and a look on his face that was trying very hard not to be anything in particular, which was how Clara knew it was good. She opened it at the kitchen table with Holt standing behind her and read it through twice before she said a word. Ellis Stafford had been formally indicted by the federal court on 41 counts of land fraud conspiracy to defraud and bribery of public officials across 4 counties in the Colorado Territory. County Clerk Harmon had agreed to cooperate with the federal prosecution in exchange for a reduced charge. 2 additional clerks had followed within 48 hours of Harmon's agreement, which was the way these things worked. The first person to talk always made it easier for the next person to decide that silence wasn't worth what it cost. Judge Alderman Price had resigned from the county bench citing health reasons, which was the polite fiction that allowed everyone to move forward without the additional proceedings that a formal removal would have required. 61 of the 68 families whose land had been fraudulently claimed were named in the recovery order. The remaining 7 cases required additional documentation that Breck's office was actively pursuing. The Calloway East pasture boundary dispute had been dismissed. The competing claim withdrawn. The original survey markers confirmed as accurate. Pete's 12 acres were listed specifically in the recovery order. Clara set the letter on the table. She pressed both hands flat against the wood and breathed in and breathed out and did not cry because she had made a decision about crying somewhere around the 14th month of collecting documents in Delwood, and the decision was that she would cry when it was finished and not before. It was finished. She cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. The quiet, thorough kind of crying that comes when something that has been held under pressure for a very long time is finally released. The kind that doesn't ask permission and doesn't apologize and simply runs its course. Holt put his hand on her shoulder and left it there and said nothing, which was exactly right. And Pete Garrett looked at the wall with great interest for about 2 minutes and then quietly let himself out to wait on the porch. When she was done, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and picked up the letter and read it a 3rd time. 41 counts, she said. Yes, Holt said. Harmon talked. First one always does, he said. My mother would have appreciated that, Clara said. She lost her case because nobody talked. She folded the letter carefully and held it in both hands. 61 families. 61, he agreed. 7 more pending. Breck will get them, Holt said. He's not the kind of man who leaves 7 families on a list. She looked at the letter one more time. Then she stood up and went to the fireplace and took the oilcloth packet from behind the stone. Still there, still holding the originals she'd carried out of Delwood in her canvas bag, and held it for a moment. 14 months of work. Carried in the lining of a bag. Protected by 3 years of practiced silence. Delivered by a woman everyone in Delwood had believed couldn't hear a word being said about her. She set it on the table beside the federal letter. I need to go to Delwood, she said. Holt looked at her. When? Soon, she said. Not today, but soon. She met his eyes. There's a woman there named Mrs. Aldrich. She's been holding copies I left with her before I came here. She doesn't know what she has. She needs to know it's over and that she's safe. She paused. And I need to see Roy. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. You don't owe him anything, Holt said. I know, she said. That's why I can go. They rode into Delwood on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the federal letter arrived. Clara wore clean clothes and her hair done properly and the canvas bag over her shoulder out of habit, though it was empty now of everything that had mattered. Holt rode beside her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and he understood that. The town looked the same. It always looked the same. The feed store, the general store, the saloon at the far end of Caldwell Street. The boardwalks warped from years of sun. The particular quality of dust that settled over everything in Delwood in the summer, as if it had given up on being cleaned. People stopped and looked. Not the way they had looked 6 weeks ago when Roy Weston was selling his daughter in the street, and the looking was the comfortable looking of spectators at something that wasn't happening to them. This looking was different. Uncertain. The specific uncertainty of people who have learned that they misread a situation entirely and are now trying to recalibrate without appearing to have been wrong. Harriet Bloom came out of the dress shop. She stopped on the boardwalk and looked at Clara and looked at Holt and then looked at Clara again. "Miss Weston," she said. "Mrs. Bloom," Clara said. She did not stop walking. Tom Garrett, her mother's cousin. The man who had looked at the ground on the day Roy sold her was outside the feed store. He saw her coming, and he didn't look at the ground this time. He looked directly at her, and on his face was the expression of a man who has spent 6 weeks with something sitting in his chest that didn't have a comfortable shape. "Clara," he said. She stopped. She looked at him. "I should have," he started. "Yes," she said. "You should have." He nodded. He had the decency not to offer an explanation, which she respected. Some things don't have explanations that are worth the breath it costs to say them. He knew what he'd done, and he knew what it had cost, and he was going to have to carry that. And the carrying of it was a more honest response than anything he could have said. She kept walking. She found Mrs. Aldridge at home, a small woman of perhaps 65 who had taken in washing and ironing in Delwood for 40 years, and who had 14 months ago accepted a sealed envelope from Clara with instructions to keep it somewhere dry and safe and tell no one, and had done exactly that without asking a single question, which was the kind of trust that Clara did not have words sufficient to repay. Mrs. Aldridge opened the door and looked at Clara, and then looked at Holt, and then looked back at Clara. "I saw the notices from the federal court," she said. "Pete Garrett's wife came by and told me." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." The envelope was exactly where Clara had left it, behind a loose board under the kitchen floorboards, which Mrs. Aldridge had identified as a suitable hiding place, with the practical expertise of a woman who had lived through difficult years and knew that the things worth keeping needed to be kept seriously. Clara took it out and held it, and felt the weight of it lighter than the oilcloth packet, the copies thinner than the originals, and felt also the weight of the 14 months it represented, and the woman who had trusted her enough to hold it. "It's over," Clara said. "You're safe. No one is going to come here asking questions about anything you held." Mrs. Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. "You were always a smart girl," she said. "I told Roy that once. He wasn't interested in hearing it." "No," Clara said. "He wasn't." "What are you going to do now?" Clara glanced back at Holt, who was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, giving them the room. "I'm going to go back to the foothills," she said. "I'm going to help organize the land recovery process for the families in the county records. Brex asked me to work with his office as a civilian consultant on the documentation." She paused. "And I'm going to live at the Calloway Ranch." Mrs. Aldridge looked at Holt, then back at Clara. "He treats you well." "He treats me like a person," Clara said, "which is more than most people managed." Mrs. Aldridge nodded slowly. Then she did something Clara hadn't expected. She reached out and took Clara's hand in both of hers and held it for a moment, with the particular grip of a woman who wants to communicate something that words don't fully cover. "Your mother would be proud," she said quietly. Clara held the woman's hands and felt something move through her chest that was different from crying and different from relief, and was something she understood after a moment was simply gratitude. The plain, specific gratitude of a person who has been seen clearly finally by someone who knew them before the world decided who they were. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Roy was in the saloon. Of course he was. He had been in the saloon for 6 weeks, by all accounts working steadily through the $20 he'd received for his daughter, with a devotion to the task that no one in Delwood found surprising. Clara walked in and stood in the doorway until her eyes adjusted and she found him at the bar. He was smaller than she remembered. He always looked smaller when she came back to him after a period of distance. The man whose presence had filled every room she'd ever been in with him seemed in the clear light of who she'd become in the past 6 weeks to be simply a man. Not large, not frightening. Just a man who had made consistently poor choices and was currently drinking the proceeds of the worst one. He saw her. He put down his glass. She crossed the room and stood in front of him and looked at him directly. The way she had not been able to look at him for 3 years without performing the specific absence of expression that the deaf performance required. "Clara," he said. His voice had the particular quality of a man who is not entirely sober and is also not entirely sure he deserves to be forgiven and has not yet decided whether to ask. "Roy," she said. He looked at her. He looked at her face, her real face, the one she'd kept hidden behind 3 years of careful blankness, and seemed to be trying to find in it some version of his daughter that was familiar to him. "I heard," he said, "about the federal case. People been talking." He picked up his glass and put it down without drinking. "I heard you were the one that—" He stopped. "That you had the documents." "Yes," she said. "All that time," he said. "You could hear." "All that time," she said. He was quiet. The saloon had gone very still around them in the way that rooms go still when something is happening that the people in them understand is private, even though it's happening in public. "I didn't know what you had," he said finally. "If I'd known—" "Roy," she said. He stopped. "It doesn't matter what you would have done if you'd known," she said. "What matters is what you did when you didn't know. You sold me for $20 on a public street because they told you I was a liability, and you decided to believe them." She kept her voice level. Not cold, not angry. Simply clear. "I've spent my whole life watching you make decisions like that. Deciding that the path of least resistance was the same as the right path. It isn't. It was never the same." Roy looked at his glass. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said. "I'm here because you're my father, and I needed to say this to your face, and then I'm going to leave." She met his eyes. "The federal case is moving. 61 families are getting their land back. 7 more pending. Stafford is going to spend the next several years in court, and he is going to lose." She paused. "None of that happened because someone powerful decided to help. It happened because I copied documents and stayed quiet and waited for the right moment and didn't run when it got dangerous." Roy said nothing. "I needed you to know that," she said. "Not to hurt you with it. Because I think somewhere you still believe I was what they told you I was. A deaf girl with nothing. A liability." She held his gaze one final time. "I need you to know that was never true, not one single day of it." She turned and walked out of the saloon. Holt was waiting outside. He looked at her face and said nothing, and fell into step beside her, and they walked back to the horses and mounted and rode north out of Delwood. In the summer heat, the same direction they'd ridden 6 weeks ago, the same road. After a mile, he said, "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like I set something down," she said. "Something I didn't know I was still carrying." "Good." "Yes," she said. "Good." The twist came on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks later, and it came from a direction Clara had not anticipated, which was the first time in a very long time that she had been genuinely surprised. A letter arrived from Missouri. Not from Breck. Not from the federal court. From a boy named Daniel Calloway, 15 years old, written in the careful, slightly formal hand of someone who had been taught to write properly and took the responsibility seriously. Holt read it at the kitchen table, while Clara organized the consulting files. Breck had sent case records for 23 families whose land recovery documentation needed to be prepared for the federal court. She was not reading over Holt's shoulder. She was giving him the privacy of his own correspondence. But she could see his face from where she sat, and she watched it change as he read. Not dramatically. Holt Calloway did not do things dramatically. But she had learned to read the small movements, the slight tightening around his eyes, the stillness that deepened rather than relaxed, and she knew before he said a word that the letter was something significant. He set it down. He looked at the table for a long moment. "Daniel wants to come here," he said. Clara set down her pen. "His aunt in Missouri is moving to Ohio," Holt said. "Her husband's found work there. They're taking the family." He looked at the letter. "Daniel doesn't want to go to Ohio. He wants—" He stopped. "He says he's been reading the territorial papers. There was a piece about the Stafford case, about a woman from Delwood who built the evidence." He looked up at Clara. "He says the paper mentioned the Calloway ranch specifically." Clara was very still. "He wrote because he wanted to know if what the paper said was true," Holt said. "And he wrote because he wants to know if there's room for him here." He set the letter flat on the table with both hands. "He's 15. He's been in Missouri since he was 4. I've seen him 4 times in 11 years. The kitchen was quiet. "What do you want?" Clara said. Holt looked at her. "I want him here," he said. "I've wanted him here for 11 years, and I was afraid to ask because I had nothing to offer a boy except a mountain ranch and a man who was—" He stopped. "Who was maintaining a life instead of living one," Clara said quietly. "Yes," he said. She looked at the letter on the table. She thought about a 15-year-old boy reading territorial newspapers in Missouri and finding his father's name in a story about 61 families and a deaf woman who hadn't been deaf, and deciding that was the direction he wanted to go. She thought about what it meant to make a decision like that at 15, which was younger than she'd been when she started making decisions under pressure, and not by much. "Write him back today," she said. Holt looked at her. "Clara." "He's your son," she said. "And this is your ranch. Write him back today and tell him there's room." She held his gaze. "There's room, Holt." He looked at her for a long moment. That deep, careful look that she had come to understand was not distance, but the opposite. The look of a man who felt things so specifically that he needed a moment to be certain before he expressed them. "You'd be all right with that," he said. "A 15-year-old boy coming into—" "I grew up without a family that worked," she said. "I know exactly what it costs. If you have the chance to give your son a home that works, and you don't take it because you're worried about whether it inconveniences me." She shook her head. "Write the letter, Holt." He wrote it that afternoon. She helped him find the words when he got stuck, which happened twice, both times in the places where what he wanted to say was larger than what he knew how to put down on paper. She didn't write it for him. She just sat beside him at the table and helped him find the shape of things he already knew, but couldn't quite get from his chest onto the page. When it was done, he read it back once, and folded it, and addressed it, and held it in his hand, and looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "Stop thanking me," she said. "I live here." He looked at her when she said it. The way a person looks at something they've wanted for a long time, and are still learning to believe they have. "Yes," he said quietly. "You do." Daniel Calloway arrived on a Friday morning 6 weeks later, which was 2 months and 3 days after Clara had ridden north out of Delwood on the back of a horse with a man she barely knew, and a canvas bag full of documents that were going to change 68 families' lives. How was tall for 15, taller than she'd expected with his father's build, just beginning to fill in, and his father's quiet way of taking in a room without announcing himself. He stepped down from the stage in Harker Crossing and looked at Holt with the careful assessing look of a boy who has thought very specifically about this moment for 6 weeks and is now determining whether the reality matches the thought. Holt stood with his hat in his hands and said, "Daniel." The boy said, "Sir." A pause that lasted about 3 seconds and contained 11 years. Then Holt crossed the distance and put his hand on his son's shoulder and said quietly enough that Clara, standing a few feet back, almost didn't hear it. "I should have asked you sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." Daniel looked at his father's face for a moment. Then he said with the particular dignity of a 15-year-old who is working hard not to show how much something means to him, "It's all right." It was not all right exactly. 11 years was 11 years, and that didn't resolve in a single sentence, but it was a beginning, and beginnings were what mattered when nothing else had started yet. Daniel looked at Clara. "You're Miss Weston," he said. "I am," she said. "The paper called you a civilian consultant to the federal marshal's office," he said. "It said you built the evidence case from documents you'd collected over 14 months while nobody knew you were doing it. The paper got most of that right, she said. He considered this with the serious, thorough consideration of a boy who respected accuracy. It also said you were sold in the street for $20, he said. That part is entirely accurate, she said, and that the man who bought you was my father. Also accurate. He looked at Holt, then back at Clara. He seemed to be assembling a picture from several pieces which Clara recognized as a family trait. Are you going to marry him? He said. The directness of it made her want to smile. She kept her face neutral with some effort. That's a conversation your father and I haven't finished yet, she said. Why not? Because there have been other things to finish first, she said. Some of them larger than that conversation. Daniel absorbed this with the same thorough seriousness. The 61 families, he said. Among other things, she said. He nodded slowly, the nod of someone who has determined that the information he has been given is satisfactory and complete. Then he picked up his bag and looked at his father and said, You mentioned there was a gray horse. There is, Holt said. Can I see him? He's in the barn, Holt said. And something in his voice when he said it, something that had been very careful and very controlled for a very long time, came slightly undone at the edges, in the good way. The way things come undone when they've been held too tightly for too long, and are finally allowed to be what they actually are. They walked toward the barn, father and son, and Clara watched them go, and felt the thing in her chest that she had been filing away for later arrive, finally completely without reservation. She picked up her bag and followed them in. The federal case against Ellis Stafford concluded, 14 months after Breck had ridden north to the Calloway ranch with 2 deputies and a face prepared to be unimpressed. It concluded with a conviction on 37 of the 41 counts, which was not perfect, but was enough for the sentences, enough for the asset recovery, enough for the land restoration orders that returned property to 66 of the 68 families on the original list. Clara was in the courtroom in Denver for the verdict, sitting in the gallery with Breck's deputy Callum beside her, and Pete Garrett on her other side, and a woman named Ruth Millward, whose family had been the first case Clara had documented, and who had driven 2 days from Lake County to be present when the man who had taken her family's land heard the word guilty spoken 37 times in a federal court. Ruth Millward held Clara's hand during the reading of the verdict. Clara let her. Ruth's hand shook slightly on the 4th count and then steadied and did not shake again, which told Clara something about the kind of woman Ruth Millward was, the kind who allowed herself one moment of visible emotion and then put it away and kept going, which was a kind of woman Clara recognized without difficulty. Stafford's lawyer filed an immediate appeal. That was expected. The appeal was denied 4 months later. That was also expected by Clara, if not by Stafford's lawyers, who had clearly underestimated the completeness of the evidence chain she had spent 14 months constructing. When Breck sent her the wire about the appeal denial, she was at the kitchen table at the Calloway Ranch working on documentation for the 7 remaining families whose cases had required additional evidence. Daniel was in the barn. Holt was on the east pasture. His east pasture confirmed and legal. The competing claim, dead and buried in the same federal proceedings that had buried Ellis Stafford. She read the wire. She read it again. She set it on the table and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the wood and her eyes on the wall, and she thought about her mother. About Helen Weston at a county office table, arguing correctly and losing because the system had been arranged against her. About 40 acres in Kansas and a debt called in, and a man who had decided there was no point in fighting. She thought about what her mother had given her. The land law. The careful handwriting. The understanding that an argument built right could stand on its own if you gave it enough structure to hold. She thought about what she had built on that foundation. 14 months of documents. A canvas bag. 3 years of silence used as armor. A mountain cowboy who had stopped in the street when everyone else had looked away. A boy from Missouri who had read the territorial papers and decided that was the direction he wanted to go. 66 families who had their land back. She thought, Mom, we won. She got up and went to find Holt. I was at the fence line checking the east pasture posts, and he looked up when he heard her coming and read her face before she said anything. Appeal denied, she said. He set down the post driver. It's done, he said. "It's done," she said. He crossed the distance between them and stood in front of her and looked at her face with that specific, careful look that she had come to understand was not distance, but the deepest kind of attention. "Clara Weston," he said. "Holt Calloway," she said. "I have a question that's been waiting about 3 months for the right moment," he said. She looked at him. "I told your son I hadn't finished that conversation yet," she said. "I know," he said. "He told me. That same evening." The corner of his mouth moved. He said, and I'm giving you his exact words, she said you hadn't finished the conversation, which means you started it, which means you should finish it before she changes her mind. Clara felt something bright and warm move through her entire chest. "He's very practical," she said. "He gets it from somewhere," Holt said. She looked at him. "Ask," she said. "Will you stay?" he said. "Not as a consultant, not as a woman who's here because the case needed her here. As—" he stopped and found the words he actually meant. "As mine, and as Daniel's, and as whatever this place needs you to be that it hasn't been before." She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the east pasture behind him, 60 acres of mountain grass with reliable water access that Ellis Stafford had tried to take and failed, and at the ranch beyond, solid and steady, on its piece of mountain ground, and at the barn, where a 15-year-old boy with his father's quiet way of taking in a room was probably introducing himself to the gray horse with the same serious, thorough approach he brought to everything. She looked at Holt Calloway, who had stopped in a street 6 months ago and paid $20 for a stranger's dignity and asked nothing for it and meant it. "I already said yes," she said. 3 months ago, at that table." "I know," he said. "I wanted to ask it right." She stepped forward and he met her halfway, which was the way everything between them had worked from the beginning. Neither of them waiting for the other to do all the moving, both of them willing to close the distance. He held her, the way a man holds something he has been careful with and is now finally allowed to hold without being careful. Fully, without reservation, with both arms, and the whole of 11 years of being alone, and the whole of the man he'd been before that, and everything in between. She held him back. The valley changed that year in ways that people talked about for a long time afterward. 66 families returned to land they had been told was gone. A federal case that had seemed impossible became the standard by which land fraud prosecutions were measured across the territory. A marshal named Breck, who had spent 20 years doing difficult work in difficult places, retired 3 years later, saying it was the best documented case he'd ever worked and the one he was most proud of. Pete Garrett got his 12 acres back. He walked the fence line of his north boundary the day the recovery order was recorded and stood at the water source that Stafford had been trying to control and looked at it for a long time without saying anything, which was more than enough. A woman named Ruth Millward, whose family had been the first case Clara documented, became a vocal advocate for land rights reform in the territorial legislature and testified before a federal committee in Washington 4 years later, citing the Stafford case as the model for what coordinated fraud looked like and how it could be dismantled if someone was willing to do the work of documenting it correctly. At the Calloway Ranch in the foothills, 22 miles north of Delwood, a boy named Daniel learned the land and the horses and his father's way of moving through difficult work without making more noise than necessary. He also learned from the woman at the kitchen table that an argument built right could stand on its own, that evidence carefully assembled and clearly presented was more powerful than any amount of money spent trying to make it go away. He took this understanding with him when he was older and used it in ways that neither his father nor Clara could have predicted, and were both in the end deeply proud of. Roy Weston died in the winter of 1882 in the Delwood saloon of the specific combination of whiskey and poor decisions that had characterized his entire adult life. Clara received word from Tom Garrett, her mother's cousin, who had looked at the ground on the day of the auction and had spent the years since trying in small ways to be a different kind of person. She read the letter and held it for a moment and felt after careful examination very little that surprised her. She had said what she needed to say to Roy's face in that saloon. The accounting between them had been settled then, not now. She set the letter down and went back to the work she'd been doing. The work was always there. That was the thing about justice. It was not a destination you arrived at and unpacked your bags. It was a direction you kept moving in every day, with whatever you had, and whoever was willing to move beside you. Clara Weston understood this better than most people. She had spent 3 years being silent about what she could hear, and 14 months building a case that everyone told her with their behavior, if not always their words, was impossible for someone like her to build. She had done it anyway. She had always been going to do it anyway. The ranch was hers now, in the legal sense. The papers recorded at the county office on a Tuesday afternoon with Breck's deputy as a witness, and Pete Garrett grinning in a way that suggested he had opinions about it. But it had been hers in the real sense. Since the morning she'd woken up before Holt, and made the fire, and found the eggs, and understood standing in that kitchen, with the pans hung in order of size, and the dry goods labeled in a plain, functional hand, that she was not passing through. She was home. Not because Roy had sold her, and this was where she'd landed. Not because the case had placed her here. Not because she was a woman with nowhere else to go. Because she had chosen it. Because she had walked toward a stranger's horse on a dusty street with her eyes open and her name her own, and she had made a decision that belonged entirely to her. That was the thing Roy had never understood. That was the thing Delwood had never understood. That was the thing. Ellis Stafford, with all his money and all his lawyers and all his 68 fraudulent land filings, had never understood. You cannot take something from a person who has already decided what they're worth. You can try. You can arrange the system against them, and call in the debts, and send 4 men on horseback, and file the competing claims, and stand in county offices and courtrooms, and make the case that they have nothing, and are nothing, and will always be nothing. But a woman who has made up her mind about her own value, a woman who has looked at the full weight of what the world thinks of her, and decided the world is wrong, is not a woman anyone can take anything from. She is the most dangerous thing in the territory, and she knows exactly how to prove it.